Kevin Allen is a sports journalist and author who has written professionally for almost 50 years. He was USA Today's lead hockey writer from 1986 to 2019, and he has written more than 25 sports books. Kevin has covered everything from Super Bowls to the Olympic Games to the World Series, NCAA basketball, and of course, the Stanley Cup Finals. Kevin's contribution to the sport of hockey has been recognized by the National Hockey League and the Hockey Hall of Fame. And in 2023, he was inducted into the Eastern Michigan University Journalism Hall of Fame. Today, he covers the Detroit Red Wings for Detroit Hockey Now. I'm excited for our conversation, and it's great to have him on the show. Welcome, Kevin, and thanks for joining us on Life Excellence.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you.
It's great to have you. Kevin, in 2013, you were the recipient of the Lester Patrick Trophy. That award, given by the National Hockey League and USA Hockey, is presented annually for outstanding service to hockey in the United States. Players, officials, coaches, and executives are eligible to receive the award. And you joined a storied list of recipients that include superstar players like Bobby Orr, Mario Lemieux, and Wayne Gretzky. And of course, closer to home, Red Wings greats including Steve Yzerman, Ted Lindsay, Gordie Howe, and longtime Red Wings owner Mike Ilitch. Then in 2014, the Hockey Hall of Fame honored you with the Elmer Ferguson Memorial Award in recognition of distinguished members of the hockey writing profession whose words have brought honor to journalism and to hockey. What do acknowledgments like that mean for you, Kevin, as someone who's devoted so much of your career and life to the sport of hockey?
Yeah, it's interesting, Brian. When you start out in this business, you don't tell yourself, I really want to achieve that award or this award or reach this area of expertise. But when you get there and you get those awards, you realize how emotional it is. And, to me, it just said that it sort of reaffirmed that I had reached my goal that was really established when I was, 7 or 8 years old, when, my goal was to be what I would call a big-time sports writer, a guy that's covered national stories, that wrote, from a national perspective. And when I got that award, I just remember as I was preparing my speech for that, I did what I set out to do. And I think that's all any of us can ask. And, very few people have been able to do what I've done, which is to turn what I considered my hobby when I was a kid, writing and being involved in sports, to a profession that allowed me, to make a living. And I always, I teach now at Eastern Michigan University, in addition to still be a working journalist. And I always tell, my students that if you go into this business, always remind yourself that you're fortunate, lucky really, to be able to do something that you truly love and get paid for it. I remember my buddy Mike Emmerich, we were talking about our careers when we started out, and Mike Emmerich was a broadcaster for NBC, and he started out working for a radio station at 140 a week. And I worked my first job out of college at a small daily in in Arizona, and I got 185 a week. And Mike said, well, the joke was on them, because what they didn't realize is we would have done it for nothing.
Well, what a wonderful opportunity, as you said, to do something you love. And the other thing I was thinking is that, and of course in sports, there is an opportunity to ultimately get recognized. And it isn't, in hockey, you want to win the Stanley Cup, right? For a player, that's the ultimate. For a coach, that's the ultimate. But then down the line a little bit further, if you're really good, you do have recognition in the Hall of Fame. And the awards that I mentioned and that we talked about, that's a way for you to get recognized at the end of your career. And I think that's unique. Obviously not all professions have that. So it must be incredibly affirming to not only do what you love, but at the end of your career, or toward the end of your career, to receive that acknowledgement that, hey, you really have stood out as not just being in the industry, but actually making a difference in your profession.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also, and this is sort of, you never think of this, when you first hear it, you're going to win the award, but it was probably just as big, maybe more so for my family than it was for me. To be able to bring them, to the Hall of Fame, and I haven't done it yet, but I have six grandchildren, and my plaque is sitting in there, and I've been trying to convince my kids to get their acts together and get all my grandkids and let them pose for a picture by my Hall of Fame plaque. I said, I don't ask for much, but I would love to see that. But it was so much fun to have all of my family there. By coincidence, I grew up in Wayne, Michigan, went to Wayne Memorial High School, and Mike Modano entered the Hockey Hall of Fame in the same year that I won the Elmer Ferguson. So I was part of that group that was honored that. So Wayne, Westland are sort of sister cities. They abut each other. Kids from Westland and Wayne both feed into Wayne Memorial High School. Mike Modano actually fed into Livonia system, but it was really sort of coincidental and fun. And we talked about it, Mike and I, that Wayne Westland would have a writer and a reporter to get in the exact same year. So that sort of added into it. The local newspaper, did a story, and here's Mike Modano, the fabulous athlete, and then the writer Kevin Allen getting in the same year. So that sort of added to it, and the fact that for those who haven't seen the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto, it's in a very historic old bank building. It's said to be haunted by a ghost of a teller that worked there 100 some years ago. So it's just a great venue as well, and it's just a heck of a party. There's a large people, so to be part of all that just sort of added to it. And I don't know. I didn't ask Mike or any of the other players, but I bet I was just as nervous making my speech as they were making theirs.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, what a great opportunity, what a great occasion, and how neat to be doing it with another hometown boy with Mike. Kevin, how did you break into the industry? You mentioned early on your love of sports. You obviously had a gift for writing. And I think a lot of people have an attraction to the sports business. If they're not athletes and can't play sports, then maybe in sports marketing or in journalism or another way. How did you actually break into the industry all those years ago?
Well, it was pretty clear to me when I was young that I loved newspapering. I remember being 7 years old and walking down Wayne Road. I lived off of Wayne Road in Wayne, and going down to put I think it was 10 cents or 15 cents to get a Detroit Free Press, and I read the great Detroit writers of that era, Joe Falls, and Jim Hawkins was covering the Tigers, and Kurt Sylvester was covering the Lions, and I read all them, and they were like demigods to me. These were people that I was just as familiar with as the great athletes in Detroit as well. And I just put all my energy into making that happen. I wasn't sure that it could, and then in eighth grade, I was going to Wayne St. Mary's, a parochial school, and I had a nun there who told me, yeah, you can do this, like you can write, and really sort of encouraged me to not to be denied, to use some perseverance and drive and ambition to fuel, because she said, look, I don't know a lot about journalism, but in most professions, talent alone won't get you there. You got to work hard, and that turned out to be true. I think what I've learned all along is that talent will get you so far, but then you need a lucky break. And mine, actually, believe it or not, was the 1984 Tigers. I was working in the Port Huron for the Port Huron Times Herald, and the Tigers won the World Series that year, but they got off to a great 35-5 start. The Port Huron Times Herald belonged to the Gannett chain, and they needed someone to sort of chronicle that 35-5 start, and I was close enough. I was covering it for the Port Huron Times Herald, so my stories got picked up and ran over the in the 100 or so Gannett papers that they had at the time. And from that, I went to Spring spring training. The following year, I covered the World Series that year. I covered the division playoffs, and then I ended up going on loan to USA Today. And when I was there was some winking and stuff, and said, the way it worked back then, you had to go back to your home paper for the proper morning period. But if they liked you, you could end up coming back. And I actually had tried to get a job at a free press, and I was getting close, and I thought I might get it at the Free Press, and I went in to see the editor of the Times Herald, and I said, I really would prefer to go back to USA Today because I'd like to be a national writer. And she said, well, let's put a call in. To get me to pull out, they offered me a job at USA Today in 1985, and I went there, and I ended up staying 34 years. I went there as a baseball writer, but we already had a multitude of baseball writers, and it just so happened that the hockey writer had stepped down to actually go to baseball, of all things. And he said to the sports editor there, Kevin's from Michigan. He probably speaks hockey fluently. Why don't you give him a shot? And they brought me in. Henry Freeman was his name. And I said, yeah, I'd be happy to do it. He says, well, we'll give it to you on a temporary basis and see how you liked it. And I held that beat on a temporary basis for 34 years.
Oh, what a great story. I know the newspaper business has certainly changed over that time. In terms of the job itself, Kevin, how is sports writing the same as it was when you started your career, and how has it changed?
That's a great question, and one that I must always discuss with my students when I teach them. How it's the same is that, much like an athlete, if anyone who's watched the Detroit Lions this season, and their turnaround and making a run, even though it didn't last as long as Detroit fans wanted it to, have heard many times it said that to have a good wide receiver, what you need to do is to get a wide receiver that can get separation from the man who's covering him. You need to get some distance, some space, so that the quarterback can get to the ball. And it's the same as true in my business. It's always been true, and it's still true. If you want to rise up and write for the top outlets, you have to get some separation from the other competitors in your field. You got to do something that distinguishes you. You either got to be the best reporter, breaking news, getting facts and unearthing stories that others don't get. You've got to be an exceptional writer, a guy that can hold interest, or you've got to be a clever, gifted lead writer. And if you have one of those, if you can get some separation, I think that's the difference. That's the same, and it was the same in 1975, when I started working and getting paid to write, and it's true now. And how it's completely different is, well, when I started, I started on a typewriter. You wrote your story on a typewriter, and then you had to send it, and we used these. It's almost like it was like a fax machine, but it took 6 minutes per page. So if you wrote a standard story, it was like 4 typewritten pages. It took you 24 minutes to send that, back to the office so it could, be typeset and then, put on a plate, for printing. And now everything is all instantaneous. And the other thing that's completely different is, the news cycle. We used to say it was 24 hours before, where, if you had a scoop, it wasn't going to be printed until the next morning. Now you have a scoop, you get it up in 10 minutes, and everybody else has it, and they're rewriting it in a minute or two. So, I've had scoops that have lasted several hours, years and years ago, or longer, because people couldn't catch up, because they had no means to do it. And now, everything you do is everywhere. And of course, now everyone is a national writer. If you write something even for a small paper, it's going to be picked up in social media, and it's everywhere almost instantaneously.
I think that's a huge difference. And you even look at the national networks like CNN, and they're using footage from people's cell phones. So they become, if I'm in the middle of a nationally newsworthy story, and I have my cell phone, then I become the reporter because I'm there, and that footage can get used. And the other thing that I've noticed, so I'm a big fan still of physical paper. I like to read physical papers. I know nobody does that anymore. But what I've noticed, like with the Wall Street Journal, is you'll read a story in Monday's paper that actually appeared in the online version, to your point, on Friday or Saturday or sometime over the weekend, because it's really, it's not instantaneous publishing, but it's publishing as soon as you can get it online. And then if there's a print medium as well, then it gets into the newspaper or the magazine whenever that happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest failing of journalism was not anticipating the internet arrival with any plan in place for what to do with it. And I think it has set journalism back because of that. If you look at the New York Times, for example, they decided to use the paywall, pretty quickly, and because of that, they're thriving today. At USA Today, we did not do that. That's been a recent development at USA Today, and I think because of it, we had difficulty back then, sort of making the changeover. We still wanted to believe that newspaper, the print edition, was going to carry us for much longer than it really did, even though it still exists, today, but not to the impact. And in the middle of my career, it was. We were printing more than 2 million copies of that, and the reach on that seemed incredible to us. But that really isn't anywhere near the reach that you can reach with the internet. You can get anywhere. I mean, once we started, I've covered 10 Olympic Games, and once we moved to an all sort of internet approach to the Olympic Games, to be able to reach, we could reach a half, or we could achieve like a 500,000 readership on some stories if it was big enough, because you're drawing readers from all over the world and not from the United States. And what the internet taught us as well is really what they were really reading. Like, we were only guessing before. Like, we would put stories in, and we used the formula that if it was unique, we wanted to write it. But we've learned that certain things that we were staples, like, for example, feature stories on athletes, that was standard operating procedure, right up until into the 90s. And then what happened is, with the internet, we discovered, readers really would rather have harder news than that they don't really need features. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because by then, almost instantly, athletes were having their own social media, and they could sort of give their own stories out on social media. So they didn't need the reporters to be a conduit to get to the fan base. They could reach the fan base on their own. So you see much fewer feature stories on athletes than you saw in the heyday of my career.
That's really interesting, and that's absolutely true. I hadn't thought about that, but players are marketing themselves. Their fans are able to go and learn about them in a variety of ways, and directly, much of it directly. Whereas, when we were growing up, for example, we didn't have that same access, and so we would wait for that feature story, or wait for the Sports Illustrated to come out, or USA Today to come out, and be able to read about those athletes. I have to tell you, Kevin, as a huge sports fan, I'm a little envious of the front row seat that you've had for now half a century, covering some of the greatest moments in sports. I know a lot of your coverage has been around hockey, but you've talked about the Olympics and baseball, and you've covered some pretty amazing events in all sports. As you reflect back on your career, what are the most memorable events or interviews you've been privileged to be part of?
Well, there's been so many. The Johnny Cash song, I've been everywhere, man. That was my theme song for a lot of years at USA Today. Early in my career, I would travel 150 days a year, and when we covered the NFL at USA Today, it was all hands on deck. So even though I was the national hockey writer, I covered, probably 300 plus NFL games in my career, and did some playoff as well, and got to some Super Bowls. And because I was living in Michigan, oftentimes they would pull me off to do a Michigan State story or a Michigan story, or going down to Indianapolis to do the NFL or Cleveland and so forth. So I got to see a lot. I did 2 NASCAR races a year because they were in Michigan, and it was convenient for me to do that. But I always found it was the stories that you couldn't really plan on that I always enjoyed the most. And the most memorable story, without question, was I went to the Arctic Circle, to Nunavut, which is a province in northern Canada, up on Hudson Bay, and I went in July, and the ice had just broken up like 2 weeks before. And Jordan Tutu as the first Inuit to be drafted into the National Hockey League. And I went up there and spent several days with him in what would be his off season, and training. And, there were no gyms there with great equipment. So, training for him would be, filling up 5-gallon paint cans with water and then running through the tundra with his niece on his back. That's how he trained. And he wanted, while I was there, since he wasn't home very much, he loved to seal hunt. So he dragged me and a photographer on seal hunting. Now, that is a lot less glamorous than you think it is. You get out and you're out in the middle of Hudson Bay, and you might as well be in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean because you don't see any land anywhere. And we were in I would say a 12 to 15-foot boat with a Johnson, 70 horsepower engine, not a life preserver to be seen, no radio, no oars. On the second day we went out, our photographer brought a satellite phone. He said, just so we could say goodbye to our wives if we go down, because, safety was not their concern. They didn't think in those terms. And, they told great stories of, being out there on snowmobiles when the ice broke off. And, yeah, and, I said, well, what do you do? And he says, well, you wait and you hope somebody will come out and brave the ice and try to bring you in. But, they lose snowmobiles when the ice thaws because they park them out there. And, it was just a crazy existence. It was daylight 24 hours there when I was out there. And it was a tremendous story. It was hard to describe, a player who had come from that environment and contrast that with, most of the American players who make it, or a lot of them, not most, but a lot of them come from pretty rich backgrounds. Prep school hockey out east is very big. A lot of great players have come through there. Contrast that lifestyle with Jordan Tutu, who, lived in, relative poverty. Went caribou hunting, not for sport but for food. And they both, the prep school kids and the Inuit from Nunavut, both ended up making the NHL. So it's one of my all-time favorite stories, learning about the culture of the Inuits. I became, friendly with Jordan, and I followed his career. He had an up and down. He conquered alcoholism as well, and he's been clean for a long time. So it's one of my all-time favorite stories, and I ended up writing a cover story on it. And when I did make my speech after the Hall of Fame, I talked about that story and the impact it had on my life.
That's a great story, and it's a unique story. You talked earlier about getting separation from other reporters. I'm not sure how many reporters had an opportunity to participate in that assignment. I just have a question about that, though. Was your editor giving you that assignment as an opportunity, or was that punishment for something that you had done?
No, believe it or not, it was my own idea. I knew the player. I knew he was coming to his first training camp, and I knew he was on the Nashville Predators, and I knew David Poyle for had many years to GM there, and I just pursued that, thinking, this could be a great story, because they had never had an Inuit before, try to make the National Hockey League. So, yeah, I tell you though, it was real eye opening because the barge only came in because basically the port was only open for a very short period every year, so they would get two barges in, so they had to fly in everything. So this was almost 20 years ago now, and even then, like milk there in Nunavut was $8.50 a gallon.
Wow.
Like a big liter of pop was like $5. It was so costly to live there, and of course, there's very little in a way of employment for the Inuit people there. So it was real. It was a real hard life. And it's obviously gets quite cold there in the winter. And my other favorite moment on that is I was out with Jordan on, I think it was probably day 3, and he wanted to take me to a couple of the islands that have lots of tribal lore and that associated with them. And we pulled up to this island. As we're coming up, Jordan reached down for a 22, and he takes his gun out and he fires a bunch of shots into like what looked like a cave. And I said, "What's that all about?" And he goes, "Well, the polar bears like to hang up there, and we go onto the island through that cave." And he said, "I just didn't want any surprises." And I thought, "Holy cow! You got to chase away the polar bears." And the other thing he told me too about learning about nature, he said that down in Manitoba, it's a very famous place. They've done documentaries where polar bears like to hang out in Churchill, Manitoba. There's a large garbage dump there. So all the polar bears, when they are looking for food, will come to Churchill, like it's the greatest restaurant ever. But, Jordan's father told me that there used to be a lot more polar bears up where he was. But then he said Manitoba passed a law that said you couldn't shoot polar bears down there. And he goes, they all just moved south, like they knew that the law had been passed and that they'd be safer. He says, because we can shoot them because Inuits have the right to hunt polar bears. He said, but you can't, if they go south about 50 miles, and it's almost like he says, they go down and go, na, 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 you can't kill us now. I mean, and we did go seal hunting. Now, I'm probably the least likely person you'll ever meet to go seal hunting. I take my grandkids to see seals at the zoo. I don't have them for Sunday dinner. But having spent time out there and having those little critters just diving under the boats and almost taunting you, like by the end, I was rooting against the seals. I really was. It was just part of their culture. And, they were trying to, they love seal meat, and it sort of changed my whole perspective on it, to go out there and be with Jordan and his friends on a seal hunting expedition. But I will say this: we were out there all day, and nobody shot a single seal while I was there.
What an eye-opening experience on so many levels, and neat that you were able to experience that yourself, and then you came back and were able to share that with your readers. Kevin, as a journalist, how do you approach a story, and what's the outcome that you strive to achieve for the reader?
Well, that's an interesting tale because they teach you about the importance of being objective, and I've never liked that perspective just for this reason. The way that I craft my story, the way I assemble in the story, the way I choose the order of the paragraphs and what's important, that's very subjective in my opinion. It is. You make decisions that and you influence the story just by what you do. So early on in my career, and I'm saying by even when I just was starting out my first year in college, I would argue with the journalism profs that the objective is not to be an objective reporter. The goal is to be fair. So that was always my when I went into a story is that I'm going to be fair. I'm going to show both sides of it, and I'm going to choose the order of the paragraphs going in, but I'm going to make sure each side gets their say. And always there's two sides. It is rare that you come across a story where everybody's in agreement. Everybody's got their take on it, and still true today. When things aren't going well, there's always different opinion on among the players and the coaches and the management about what's happening out there, and everybody can look at the same thing but come away with different perspectives. So I think that's one of my strengths is that I've always been able to sort of sort out all the different opinions and present them in such a way where I let my readers have an understanding that, hey, it's not all black and white. There's a lot of gray there, and I think that's true. I've often said one of the things that readers often ask me is well, you make predictions on games and you're wrong sometimes, and I always say, well, I'm wrong a lot of the times. But I said this is why. I said the difference between me as a fan and me and a fan is this, like I know that I don't have even though I'm very close to the game and I live in this world with athletes and coaches and everything, I understand and know that I have no idea who's going to win because there are so many variables that's impossible to know that. But a fan really doesn't understand that. Like they think there really is a way to know like who's going to win every game, and that's just impossible. It really comes down to mathematics, probabilities, and you can. And I always tell people, you replay that game that you just watched, tomorrow, it'll look completely different because something will happen, happenstance, a fumble, in hockey, a puck that clangs off the post instead of tucking inside the post. So many different things. And if I ever write a book about my career as a sports writer, there'll be a chapter devoted to all the odd things that happened. And I think the best you can hope for in terms of determining the outcome is to do what we now do now because of the betting world. But I've been doing this since the 1980s, where I would say if these two teams played 10 times, one team would win 7 times probably, and one would win 3. And now what we see on the screen all the time, they're always talking about probability. Well, that's how I've always viewed it, because there's never no chance, and the 1980 Olympic team proved that. There's never no chance for a team to win. There's always some chance. David sometimes does defeat Goliath. So I think that's how I've always looked at it. And if you're going to speak in declarative sentences in the sports world, you're always going to be disappointed.
That's a really interesting perspective. It seems challenging, especially for, well, not just for sports writers, but for sports writers covering a particular team or even a particular sport, to keep stories fresh and engaging. And I had the term beat writer came into my consciousness. It's the same kind of thing when you're writing about the same area or the same sport or the same team continually. And I'm curious, what do you do to avoid, I'll say, cookie cutter reporting from game to game or season to season, and to continually capture stories in a unique and compelling way? If you're reporting on so now you're covering the Red Wings, and the Red Wings play night after night after night, and sure, they travel to different cities and they play different teams, but what do you do as a writer? And what do you do for yourself, frankly, because you've been doing it for 50 years? How do you continually capture stories for yourself and for your readers that make it unique and fresh and compelling?
That's a great question. I think that's at the heart of where journalism is today in terms of trying to do it in such a way. We have so much thrown at us now in terms of sports. Like we have all the statistics we need, and now we have advanced statistics, the analytics, and so forth. So keeping it fresh is a real challenge. I've always tried to do it, and I'm maybe I do it less so now that I'm older, because there is one other element that gets into it. The drive to get immediacy sometimes gets in the way of writing fresh stuff, because people do want to know the information now. So it becomes very important. Like if you hear of an injury or a trade, like you can't say, well, it's 9 o'clock now, I'll research it and write it up at noon. That's lost. You've lost all your readers by then. So there is this need for urgency that gets in the way of the freshness that you're speaking of. But my way of doing has always been to sort of bring metaphors in outside the world of sports. I remember, it just comes to mind, but I was once describing Slavik Kozlov, who was a Red Wings player who took interesting routes to get to the net. And, I described his skating style as, think of a 4-year-old with a crayon and just drawing on a paper, and it looks kind of like he's going this way and that way. Well, that's how Kozlov looked when he went to the net. He never, went this way. He never went in a straight line. It was always back, and it was a really sort of thing. So I've always sort of had that sort of thing where I've brought in, other sports to try to, sort of freshen it up. Like I talk about, hockey players that, play like linebackers, and I've, talked about other things as well. So you've got to find different ways to sort of express what they're doing on there that isn't just the same rehashing of the cliches that, accompany the sport you're covering.
And that's actually true of writing in general, right? If we can describe it
Sure.
in a way that people understand, that or associate it with something that people understand, then they're more inclined to sort of shake their head and, oh yeah, I get that. Anybody who's been around children knows what that's like to have a child color with a crayon and have it sort of go here and there and everywhere.
Yeah.
And even for a non-hockey fan, they can understand what it is that you're describing Kozlov's path to the net that way. Kevin, what do you love about the career that you've been able to work in for nearly 50 years?
Well, I love the fact that I'm, pushing towards 70. I'm 69, and yet, I'm still able to do it. I still enjoy it. They'll still pay me to do it. Like, there are very few, like, we've reached the point, and this is really about, society and our culture as well. Like, people, say things like, "Why are you still working?" Like, like I shouldn't be working. I should be out doing this. But what if you enjoy your work? Like, isn't there room for somebody who just likes it, that doesn't feel like they're working? And I feel the same way. I didn't know that I would, but I feel the same way about teaching. I didn't set out to be a teacher, but now that I'm doing it, like, I really enjoy it. Like, it's not. Even though there's a lot of work involved, it takes me a while to prepare lectures because I've not been doing it my whole life. But yeah, I still like it. I like the connection, and I think that's what I really appreciate. That there's certain jobs where if you get older, you can no longer continue to do them. But I can do this job. I'm still doing it, and I'm doing it well enough that they want me around. And I'm really, really, really enjoying it. Like, I never want to diminish, especially for that it's not work, because it is. It is work, but it doesn't often feel like work. That I'm going to a game, and it would be better if I could convince the NFL and the NHL and all the other sports to play their games maybe starting at 10:30 in the morning, so we could be wrapped up by 1, and they wouldn't have to play them always at 7 o'clock at night, because I don't like driving at night as much anymore. But but they're probably not going to do that. But that's what I like best about it is this job has kept me interested and employed for half a century. And I remember I got my first job in a college paper, and I went in before the semester had started in my freshman year, and I had had a student teacher in high school at Wayne Memorial. I was going to go to the University of Michigan, and she said, "You're making a mistake." Now, she had come from Eastern Michigan, and she said the Eastern Echo and the Michigan Daily college papers are comparable papers. They're both very good. The one difference is that there are so many journalism majors at Michigan. You won't get on the Michigan Daily until you're a junior. There's no major for journalism at Eastern. There is now, but there wasn't then in 1974. And she said, if you show up and walk into that office before the semester starts, you'll be their number one writer because they don't have anybody else. So you go in there, and he said, you'll be running the thing by the time you're a managing editor. Well, I changed. I was going to go to Michigan, and I withdrew, and you could just essentially at that point call up and get into Eastern Michigan without much consternation, and I did, and that's exactly what I did. I went in August and joined the Eastern Echo. My first assignment was to talk to George Mans, who was the football coach, and I remember he said to me, "Well, how long have you been with the Echo?" And I said, "About 20 minutes," and because they had hired me, and then I had walked over to the field house and had done the preview for the football team. So. I that sold me on that this was going to be a great profession. The fact that I went in there and I was able to hand myself in. You got to reach the point when you're a writer, and I often talk to my students about this as well. You've got to quickly get to the point where you realize the worst I'm going to be, even on my worst days, is I'm going to be adequate. Because because when you don't feel that way, if you don't have the confidence to know that you're worried to try stuff, leads that will it work or won't it work? Well, you won't try it if you're afraid all the time. So you got to reach the point where you got enough confidence that you're going to put a story out there and never be embarrassed, and then you'll start to try some things that will earn you a rise in the profession. And and it's just a very rewarding profession. You spend a lot of time watching a lot of fun games. And you mentioned that, I've seen so many different things in my life and interviewed so many great people. I've done one-on-one interviews with Michael Jordan and, Al Gore when he was vice president. I've interviewed Gerald Ford, the late Gerald Ford, several times. Talked to the top athletes and at the Olympics and so forth, and a lot of movie stars that I've crossed paths with because of the sports situation as well. So it's brought me in to places that I never would have been able to get into had I not been a journalist.
Well, you've had a great career and a great life, and I say just keep writing as long as you can, and as long as some forum will allow you to do that. Kevin, as it happens, as we're recording this, we're about to witness a historic event in hockey as Alex Ovechkin closes in on Gretzky's record for the most career regular season goals. And I think right now, as we're recording this, he's 18 goals away from surpassing Gretzky's 894 goal record, a record, by the way, that he's held since he retired, which has been now almost 25 years. When I think about GOATs in sports, I personally believe Gretzky's the greatest player to ever play the game of hockey. Who do you think is the best player ever in the NHL? And does Ovechkin enter into the debate once he breaks the scoring record?
That is another just great question. Ovechkin, we talked before too about how, one of the things I like about sports is that it often surprises us, the results. And we say things that we shouldn't. We say things, it's a record that'll never be broken. And one of the records that we've said that about was Gretzky's, because this was a guy when getting 100 points was considered incredible. He got 215. Wayne Gretzky did, and he had 92 goals one year. Like, he was just incredible in the 80s. He was so much better than everyone else that we did say, like, well, that record will never be broken. But along came Alex Ovechkin, and what's sometimes lost about Ovechkin is that he was scoring 50 goals continuously, 50 plus goals at a time when scoring goals was really hard. Like, Wayne Gretzky, he did all that, and he was better than everyone else. But there were a lot of people it was the wide open 1980s and early 90s when he was scoring those goals. There were other players, including, Steve Yzerman topped 150 points as well. So there were guys getting a lot of points. Nobody was doing the kind of scoring that Ovechkin did when he did it. This was a defensive league. Then, he was doing it at a time when kids were coming up, having gone to defensive school every summer for 10 and 12 years. Like even Pee-wee 7-year-olds were playing the neutral zone trap. Like it was very, very difficult. And I think Ovechkin, and a lot of this is because he's Russian, and we don't know him as well. Early in his career, for a lot of years, he was hard to understand. His accent was thick. He didn't enjoy the interview process, so we didn't know a lot about him. But I think he's going to be one of those players. Is we're going to appreciate him a lot more when he's retired. Once we think about it, about what we saw. And, again, he played in Washington, not a high profile team. It's not the Maple Leafs. It's not the Rangers. It's not the Bruins. It's not the Red Wings. It was the Washington Capitals. It took him a long time to win a cup. And so for all those reasons, I just don't think he has really gotten to do that he's deserved for what he's accomplished. And what he's accomplished is amazing. For him to have beat a record that most of us thought would never be broken, never be broken. And he did. He's going to do it. There's no doubt about it. And Wayne Gretzky knew for a while that it was going to happen. And even though he's very gracious about it, because that's who Wayne is, it's gotta sting a little bit. Like this. Like you said, a lot of people believe he's the greatest. I think it's Gordie Howe, but I'm biased. I grew up in Detroit. I saw him play in the WHA. I just think he added a physical element to the other guys. But really, if you ask me my professional opinion, what I would say is there were really four players that have sort of changed the game. There was Gretzky, who was the first creative, intellectual player who utilized like the net, and like it was a player. He used the net as to set a pick so he could score more goals, and he could pass from behind there. There was Bobby Orr, who was the most spectacular player in NHL history. Mary Lemieux was by far the greatest goal scorer. I would say in my 30-some years of covering the league, nobody was better on a breakaway than Mary Lemieux. But you know who I thought was second? Steve Yzerman of the Detroit Red Wings. People forget about that because he became a two-way player. But when he first came in the league, he was next to Mario. He was the second best player on the breakaway. And then there's Gordie Howe, who added a physical element. He was an intimidating force. So there was those four players. Now, I would like to add Ovechkin to that because, I still think Mario was a better goal scorer just because he could score so many different ways. Alex Ovechkin, and that's what makes him so incredible, is that he scored most of those goals from the same spot. He set up on the left wing circle, the puck would come across to him, and Marc-Andre Fleury, who's retiring this year, said to me one time, "We all know where he's going to be. We all know how hard that shot is. We're all ready for it, and it still just flies by us." And I think that's the other thing about him that makes so great. He says, "Yeah, go ahead and stop me," and you can't, and nobody has. So I don't know that he'll ever break into that top four in terms of the way we view him. And I think it's for a lot of reasons, starting with the fact that, like I said, he was Russian and early in his career, we didn't truly understand him. I don't think it helps him either that, he's friends with Putin as well, which it suddenly became an issue. And he didn't win till late in his career. He finally won, which was important, but all that issue. But I think it's a fun story, and I do think the people in the game do appreciate him. Like they know that Ovechkin is special, and he's a special player.
Well, you have to, whether you like him or don't like him, or he's Russian or not Canadian or American or whatever he is. You certainly, so I'm a student of excellence, and as an admirer of excellence, you have to appreciate what he's done, and even Gretzky, I think, has appreciation for that. He might not like it, but I mean, on the other hand, for Wayne, I think he'll have 56 other NHL records. And
Yeah.
I think when all's said and done, he'll still have a few that maybe don't get broken. Kevin, as you know, our show is called Life Excellence. And I'm curious, what does excellence mean to you?
Um, And now at the late stages of my career, we talk about it a lot. I'm part of uh, 3 Hall of Fame selection committees, and the U.S. Hockey Hall of Fame, and a journalism, and 2 Journalism Hall of Fames, and we talk about excellence as well. That it's not, if you want to be the best of the best, you got to be extraordinary, excellent as well. And I think that what sports has taught us is that. It's not as simple as who's good, who's bad, and who's average. There's other layers to being a good player, and excellence is in my opinion, is a category that very few players make. They you keep the pyramid, of course, just keeps going up like this, and you start at the bottom, and when you're a little league player, you're a decent ball player, and you go up, and maybe you can play in high school, and then some of those players go to college, and soon you get to the end, then it's a really small sample. Well, that small sample then leaves room for maybe 10, 20 players at the top that have the excellence of the game. In baseball, we've really got it down. Like, with all the players that you are required to hold a major league season, the only a fraction, make it to the Hall of Fame, and those are the players that have excellence. And I think that's the case in any profession as well. Like, I can identify the writers and that I've met who I think have an excellence about them that never wavered.
That's great, and I appreciate you sharing that, Kevin. You've written more than 25 sports books, and I definitely want to ask you a question about the books you've written, because you've been so prolific. In addition to the writing that you've done, the newspaper writing that you've done for 50 years. And a lot of those books have highlighted the sport of hockey and those who played it. And of course, you've diverted occasionally into other sports like baseball and football. Detroit is such a great sports town, like we've talked. And I'm sure that made it a little bit easier to find material for at least some of your books and articles. You mentioned Gordie Howe, and I want to ask you about Gordie. One of your books is Mr. and Mrs. Hockey, a tribute to the sport's greatest couple. Tell us what it meant to you to write a book about Gordie and Colleen Howe and the impact they had not only on hockey in Detroit, but throughout the league.
Well, I really enjoyed that book just because of the uniqueness. I mean, Colleen Howell, because, and we now know this is the case, women oftentimes, and we've heard the stereotype early on, they would describe women as pushy. When really they were just doing the job. Like, she acted as an agent, and not just for Gordy. Like, you talk to, like, Glenn Hall, who's still alive, by the way. He talks about how Colleen Howe changed the memorabilia and the autograph world for everybody. Like, even at a time when the hockey players were not making, great salaries, they still needed the jobs in the off season. Colleen was the first to say, hey, if you want my husband's time, you're going to have to pay for it. If he's going to come and sign autographs, he'll do some for charity. And trust me, Gordie Howe did plenty of charity work. But, if you want him to sign hockey cards or photos that you're going to make money out of, there's going to be a price for that, and we're going to set that. And, Glenn Hall told me that, he'd get a call from Colleen saying, yeah, I'm going to bring a bunch of people in to sign autographs. Glenn, do you want to come along? And we're going to get about, whatever it was, $5 or $10 per autograph for the guys. And he really appreciated that. And I think she was well ahead of her time. I mean, Howard Baldwin, when Gordie signed in the World Hockey Association, talked about how difficult the negotiations were with Colleen. Like, she knew and understood Gordie's value. And, that was important. I mean, and sometimes it gets me in trouble on radio shows when I say that I've never been offended by how much money athletes make, because they're the show. They're the workforce. They're the employee. They're not the employer. They can't play for anyone they want. There are a lot of rules, a lot of hoops they got to jump through in order to do it. They have to give up the privacy in order to get that. So I really respected Colleen and what she did, for the hockey world. Not everybody loved her because she was tough. She could be hard to deal with, but I heard many stories about her from people who knew her, about how she stood up if there was a player not treating their wives correctly. It was Colleen who had something to say to them, and of course Gordy loved her, without a doubt. When she developed a form of dementia, he stayed with her right to the bitter end. He did not want her in a home where to have others take care of him. He wanted to be a part of it, and theirs was an incredible love story. They met at a bowling alley. What's more romantic than that? So anyway, I did appreciate that book as well, and I've always appreciated the fact that I've gotten to do a wide range of. I ended up going to my publisher. I used one publisher for I would say 60% of my books, and I told him, I said, I'd like to do a book on Willie Horton, in Detroit. This was the guy that during the riots in 1968, he went out in his uniform and stood on a tank and tried to get the people not to riot and so forth. And the guy said, well, that sounds like a great story. He goes, how long have you known Willie? And I said, I don't know him at all. And he said, well, why do you want to do a book? I said, because I just know that it would be a great story, and I've seen him around enough to know that he would be a good guy. And I really enjoyed my book. Actually, I did a couple with Willie Horton, and I enjoyed those, and it was just great to learn his side of the story and what went through, and really. I learned about the layers of racism that was involved in the early '60s that I didn't know existed, because we knew that Hank Aaron got death threats when he was chasing down Babe Ruth's record, but Willie Horton, he couldn't even stay in the same hotels with the other Tiger players. And when he first got to the organization, and he had a great story about Mickey Stanley, a white player, saying, well, let me off at the black hotel too, and I'll stay with Willie. And of course, the black hotel didn't want to let him in, because he said, they won't be happy with me that if I let a white player stay in a black hotel. So, I've had the great fortune to be able to talk to a lot of different people in a lot of different sports, and it's really, it kept it fresh for me that I've been able to do that.
Kevin, this has been great, and I really appreciate our conversation. Thank you so much for being on the show. I'm very grateful for your time today.
My pleasure.
Thanks for tuning into Life Excellence. Please support the show by subscribing, sharing it with others, posting about today's show with sports journalist Kevin Allen on social media, and leaving a rating and review. You can also learn more about me at brianbartes.com. Until next time, dream big dreams and make each day your masterpiece.